wind that moved across the Bosporus on that April morning in 1204 carried a strange silence with it. Not the silence before creation, but the silence before destruction. Constantinople rose from the water like a vision carved into stone. Domes catching the pale light, the golden roof of the great palace glimmering through mist, and the Theodosian Walls stretching across the land like a spine built to hold back the world. For 9 centuries, no enemy had breached this city. Not Persians, not Arabs, not Bulgars, not even the armies of the greatest caliphs. To its people, Constantinople was the city God protected. But the threat that gathered this morning did not come from Islam, nor from pagan kingdoms of the north. The sails on the horizon did not bear crescents. They bore crosses, red, white, bold. They were Crusaders, men sworn to defend Christendom, now preparing to attack its greatest Christian fortress. From the towers of Blachernay, Byzantine lookouts stared in disbelief. The sea below was filled with Venetian war galleys, high-prowed, iron-tipped, bristling with archers. Behind them lumbered transport ships carrying armored knights who had taken vows before altars, kissed relics, and promised to shed their blood only against the enemies of God. But history has a way of twisting oaths into weapons. The First Crusade had marched for Jerusalem. The Children's Crusade had marched for miracles. The Fourth Crusade marched for something far colder: debt, politics, and the ambitions of men who mistook self-interest for providence. Inside Hagia Sophia, the largest church in the Christian world, morning liturgy began as usual. Priests recited prayers for mercy and protection. No one imagined that within days the same marble would shake under the boots of drunken soldiers, and that the cross above the altar would look down on men who wore its symbol while tearing the church apart. Outside the walls, another sound rose: the creak of siege towers, the thump of anchors, the clatter of mailed fists tightening straps and helmets. Among the leaders stood an old man who would become the symbol of this betrayal. Enrico Dandolo, the blind doge of Venice. Age had clouded his eyes, but not his will. To him, Constantinople was not a holy city. It was a debt to collect, a rival to break, and a gateway to trade routes that could make Venice master of the seas. Around him, Crusader barons whispered the lies they needed to believe. They told themselves God would understand, that this was a temporary sin, a necessary detour before they finally sailed to the Holy Land. In their hearts, they knew better, for no matter how they justified it, the truth was simple and unbearable. Crusaders were about to wage war on Christians. As the sun climbed higher, the banners of Venice unfurled, the winged lion of St. Mark roaring in the wind. Trumpets split the morning air. Oars dug into the water. On the walls, the people of Constantinople gathered in stunned silence. Old men clutched icons. Women whispered prayers. Children stared at the forest of masts rising from the sea, unable to understand how the cross, the very sign carved above their church doors, could now appear on the sails of an invading army. A Byzantine chronicler later captured the moment in a single line: "We saw our brothers, and we understood they were coming to kill us." Faith stood on one side of the walls. Ambition stood on the other. Between them lay the greatest Christian city ever built, about to be torn apart, not by its enemies, but by its supposed defenders. The crusade that had begun with hymns was about to descend into fire, and Constantinople would pay the price. Long before the first siege tower touched the walls, Constantinople was already under attack, not from catapults, but from debts, rivalries, and promises made in desperation. For decades, the Byzantine throne had been less a crown than a revolving door. Emperors were not merely crowned in Hagia Sophia. They were also blinded, imprisoned, and quietly removed when they ceased to serve the ambitions of others. Isaac II Angelos, once hailed as the guardian of God's chosen empire, had fallen like so many before him, blinded, imprisoned, left to decay in a palace cell, a living reminder of how fragile earthly glory truly was. His son, Alexios Angelos, escaped westward with little more than a name and a claim. In the courts of Europe, that would have meant nothing, unless it came with an offer. Alexios made one that would change Christian history. He promised the Crusaders the impossible. If they restored him to the throne of Byzantium, he would submit the Eastern Church to Rome, pay them an enormous sum of gold, provide ships and supplies, and even march with them to Jerusalem. For a young exile, it was fantasy. For the Crusaders, crushed under debt to Venice, it sounded like salvation. The Fourth Crusade was already on the brink of collapse. Far fewer knights had answered the call than expected. The fleet Venice built, at enormous cost, waited in its lagoons for an army that had not fully arrived. The Crusaders owed the Venetians a debt so vast it could sink the entire enterprise. Then came Alexios, shimmering with promises. The Crusader lords smelled opportunity. Venice smelled profit. Only Pope Innocent III smelled danger. From Rome, he wrote warnings like a man trying to stop a storm with ink. You will not attack Christians. You will not shed Christian blood. You will not turn the Holy Cross into a weapon against your own brothers. But a crusade in debt is a crusade easily steered. First, the Crusaders helped Venice capture the Christian city of Zara to partially pay what they owed. A crime that horrified the Pope and foreshadowed what was to come. Then, drawn deeper into Alexios's bargain, they turned their gaze toward Constantinople itself. By the spring of 1203, the fleet that should have sailed for the Holy Land instead rowed toward the greatest Christian city on earth. When the Crusaders saw Constantinople's skyline for the first time, its layered walls, vast palaces, and Hagia Sophia's dome glowing like a captured sun, many realized they were looking at a civilization older and richer than anything in the Latin West. Awe warred with envy. On the walls, the Byzantines stared back in disbelief. The banners on the ships were not crescents. They were crosses. The first exchanges were diplomatic, almost polite. Crusader envoys declared they had come only to restore the rightful emperor, Isaac II, and his son Alexios. The Byzantines replied with the weary sarcasm of a people long used to palace coups. Rome does not choose our emperors. Latins do not rule Constantinople. Take your crusade to Jerusalem. But the Crusaders had not come for advice. They had come for payment. Behind every pious phrase lay a ledger. Behind every sermon, a debt. Faith was no longer the compass. Debt was. When negotiations failed, the truth could no longer be buried under hymns and banners. A crusade blessed in Rome, born to liberate Jerusalem, was about to lay siege to Constantinople, not as a tragic accident, but as the result of choices made in council halls, counting houses, and back rooms where gold weighed more than scripture. The strangest chapter in the history of holy war had begun. The cross was now pointed at the heart of Christendom itself. By the winter of 1203-1204, Constantinople no longer watched the Crusaders from a distance. It heard them. The creak of their siege engines, the murmur of their campfires at night, the muffled clang of armor in the mist. The city that had withstood armies from every horizon now found itself surrounded by men who claimed to be its allies and behaved like its jailers. The Theodosian Walls still towered over the plains, as imposing as ever. But walls cannot hold back the kind of rot that begins inside. Alexios IV, installed as emperor thanks to Crusader swords, was drowning in the promises he had made. He had pledged vast sums of gold and silver, food for the armies, and support for a march to Jerusalem. But the imperial treasury, drained by years of misrule, simply could not give what did not exist. To pay the Latins, the new emperor ordered taxes that crushed his own people. Gold was stripped from icons. Church treasures were melted down. Sacred reliquaries were opened like strongboxes. The people of Constantinople did not see a ruler fulfilling his obligations. They saw a puppet bleeding the empire for the sake of foreign knights. Hatred of the Latins, long simmering beneath the surface, began to boil. In the Crusader camp, frustration grew just as quickly. They had deposed an emperor, raised another, and still the payment did not come. Winter bit through their tents. Supplies ran low. Many knights asked what no leader wanted to hear. Why are we still here? When do we go to the Holy Land? But they could not simply leave. Without Byzantine gold, their massive debt to Venice would crush them. Without a victory, their reputations would be ruined. Faith had led them east. Now survival chained them to the walls of a city they were never meant to attack. The tension snapped in fire. One night, a quarrel, a spark, a torch. The details changed in the telling, but the result did not. Flames leapt from building to building. For 3 days, a great fire devoured quarter after quarter of Constantinople. Markets burned, homes collapsed. Churches melted in showers of glass and gold. When the smoke cleared, tens of thousands were homeless. The people no longer saw the Crusaders as misguided pilgrims. They saw them as arsonists. Into this chaos stepped a man ready to harness the city's rage. Alexios Doukas, called Mortsouphlos. Ruthless, ambitious, openly hostile to the Latins, he read the mood with perfect clarity. In a swift, brutal move, he seized the palace, imprisoned Alexios IV, and declared himself Emperor Alexios V. The young ruler the Crusaders had raised to power was quietly strangled. The message to the Latins could not have been sharper. Your emperor is dead. Your promises mean nothing. You will not be paid. In the Crusader camp, shock turned to fury. They had risked everything for Alexios IV, their honor, their mission, their standing with Rome. Now he lay in an unmarked grave, and the city they had saved was ruled by a man who openly defied them. Negotiation gave way to calculation. Debt, anger, and the taste of near victory combined into a single, fateful decision. If Constantinople would not pay what it owed, then Constantinople would be taken, The crusade that had once dreamed of Jerusalem now fixed its gaze on a different prize. Not the Holy Sepulchre, but a Christian capital whose walls were about to meet the full force of an army that no longer believed in restraint. The morning tide crept quietly across the Golden Horn, carrying the charred remains of burned ships and shattered docks. Smoke from the fires still hung over the water like a low, gray ceiling. Behind that veil, the Venetian fleet moved into position. Constantinople had always trusted the sea. The great chain across the Golden Horn, drawn tight between towers, had kept hostile fleets at bay for centuries. The sea walls, though lower than the land walls, had turned back every navy that challenged them. But no previous enemy had brought Venice. The Venetians approached like men who had measured every current and wind. Their galleys slid forward with precise, deadly rhythm. On their decks rose wooden towers, floating siege engines built higher than the sea walls themselves. The defenders gaped in disbelief. Church bells rang. Priests marched along the ramparts carrying icons, lifting them high so that the face of Christ would confront the attackers. Greek archers crowded the parapets. Some had fought Turks, Normans, and Slavs. None had imagined they would one day aim their arrows at men who also crossed themselves before battle. On the ships, the Venetians did not hesitate. Trumpets sounded, oars dug deep, arrows darkened the sky, bolts slammed into stone. Under this storm, Byzantine defenders were forced to crouch behind the merlons, unable to show their faces without inviting death. Then the grappling hooks flew. Iron claws bit into the battlements. Ropes strained. The ships groaned as they were pulled tight against the walls. Defenders chopped at the lines, severing some, but more flew up to replace them. The Venetians worked with the cold discipline of men who had stormed fortified ports from one end of the Adriatic to the other. A wooden bridge crashed down from the highest tower, its planks rattling as it met stone. The first Venetians crossed in a tight shield wall, their boots thudding in unison. Greek defenders met them with spears and swords. For a moment, the narrow walkway became a seesaw of death, swaying between sea and city. Somewhere along the wall, a jar of Greek fire arced through the air, struck one of the towers, and burst into flame. The tower burned like a funeral pyre. Men screamed as they leapt into the water rather than be consumed. A cheer rose from the Byzantine ranks. But it did not last. Fresh galleys surged forward, their towers untouched by fire. More ladders clattered against the stone. The Venetians threw themselves at the wall again and again, trading blood for footholds. At last, one small section of the sea wall fell. A tower was taken, the defenders cut down or forced to flee. Above it, the banner of St. Mark, the winged lion, snapped in the wind. On shore, Crusader forces saw the lion banner rise and knew what it meant. The breach had begun. Assaults on the land walls intensified. Byzantine commanders were forced to divide their already thin reserves. The city that had once looked unassailable now fought on too many fronts at once. Behind the wall, panic spread through the streets. Civilians rushed toward the city's interior, dragging children, icons, and whatever goods they could carry. Priests tried to lead processions of prayer. No one had time to join. On the parapets, men slipped in blood and ash. Below, The waters of the Golden Horn, once a shining harbor of trade and ceremony, churned with wreckage and corpses. By midday, the Venetians held a permanent foothold. By nightfall, the seawall was no longer a shield. It was a doorway. Constantinople had been breached, not by infidels, but by an army whose ships carried crosses on their sails. What followed would not be siege warfare. It would be dismemberment. The summer heat lay over Constantinople like a heavy cloak, trapping the smell of smoke, sweat, and something harder to name: humiliation. The fires of 1203 had left scars that never fully faded. Whole quarters were still blackened. Charred beams jutted from ruined houses like broken ribs. Markets that once overflowed with silk and spices now felt thin, nervous, watched. The people knew whom they blamed. Latin soldiers walked through their streets with the swagger of men who believed God was on their side, and history would agree. The Byzantines saw something else. Armed foreigners who had burned their homes, insulted their priests, and demanded payment from an empty treasury. Anger began with small gestures. A door shut a little too hard when a crusader passed. A merchant refusing to serve a Latin customer. An insult muttered in Greek that needed no translation. But in Constantinople, anger never stayed small. Alexios IV, the emperor the Crusaders had placed on the throne, stood at the center of the storm. He had promised what no ruler could safely promise: unimaginable sums of money, submission to Rome, alliance in a war far from his own borders. To pay even a fraction, he taxed his people until they bled. He stripped gold from icons, sold church treasures, and pawned the dignity of an empire older than the kingdoms his allies came from. To the people of Constantinople, he was not a monarch. He was a man who had sold their future to foreign debt collectors. Unrest flared into open violence. Riots broke out in the markets. Latin merchants were attacked. Venetian warehouses burned. Gangs roamed the alleys, shouting, "Death to the Latins!" And for the first time since the Crusaders' arrival, fear flowed in the opposite direction. In the palace, Alexios IV watched his support collapse. His father, Isaac II, was blind and powerless. The court factions he depended on melted away. When he looked for loyalty, he found calculation. When he looked for allies, he found a man waiting for his moment: Alexios Doukas, Mortsouphlos. Confident, ruthless, and unashamedly anti-Latin, Mortsouphlos read the city like a map. He knew where the hatred flowed. He followed it straight to the throne. In a swift coup, he stormed the palace with armed men, seized Alexios IV, and declared himself emperor. Within days, the former ruler was strangled in his cell. A quiet death for a man whose promises had shaken Christendom. The message to the Crusaders was brutally clear: your emperor is dead. Your leverage is gone. Your gold is not coming. In the Crusader camp, disbelief hardened into fury. They had staked their honor and their mission on Alexios IV. Now they had neither money nor the pretense of backing a rightful ruler. They demanded payment from the new emperor. Alexios V laughed. He fortified the walls, rallied the citizens, and made no secret of his hatred for the Latins. The city, for the first time, stood united, not behind a vision of empire, but behind a shared desire to expel those they now saw as invaders. What had begun as a political bargain completed its transformation. This was no longer a dispute over debts or thrones. It was a collision between two Christian worlds that no longer recognized each other. In the Crusader councils, torchlight flickered over armored faces and angry eyes. Baldwin of Flanders, Boniface of Montferrat, Venetian commanders, knights who had marched under banners blessed in cathedrals, now spoke of sack and conquest. If the city would not keep its promises, they argued, then the city itself would be the payment. They decided to attack again, not to negotiate, not to pressure, but to take. The Fourth Crusade, launched to reclaim the tomb of Christ, now prepared to destroy the greatest Christian city on earth. The walls of Constantinople had repelled 1,000 threats. Now they braced for the most terrible once of all. A Christian army that no longer believed it was committing a sin. The dawn of April 12th, 12 rose behind a curtain of smoke drifting low across the Golden Horn. Smoke from burning towers, scorched ships, and the last desperate night of preparations inside Constantinople. The hills of the Queen of Cities were strangely quiet, as if the old empire was holding its breath. Then the horn sounded. Venetian galleys surged forward first, narrow hulls cutting clean lines through the water, their oars rising and falling with the mechanical discipline of men who had lived their lives in battle against wind, tide, and rival fleets. Mounted on their decks were the great wooden siege towers, rising almost level with the sea walls. This was Venice's genius. A floating army, a navy turned into a land assault. From the battlements, Byzantine defenders answered with firepots, arrows, and boiling oil. Greek fire splashed across the sea in streaks of green flame. The Varangian Guard, those giant axe-wielding warriors from the north, held the parapets with grim determination. But their courage could not mask the truth. They were outnumbered, leaderless, and fighting an enemy who had abandoned doubt long ago. The first clash came when Venetian ships smashed against the sea walls, iron rams embedding in stone. Grappling hooks flew upward, biting into merlons. Ropes were pulled taut, drawing ships and walls closer together until they shuddered as one structure. A burning tower collapsed into the sea, sending a column of smoke spiraling into the sky. For a brief moment, the Byzantines cheered, but the Venetians only shifted to the next ship. Steady, relentless, methodical, by mid-morning, the breakthrough came. A single galley locked itself into place beneath a section of the wall. The siege tower atop its deck rose high enough for a handful of Crusader knights to leap onto the parapet. The first was cut down. The second fell to an arrow. But the third and fourth held the line. Within minutes, dozens more crossed the narrow gangplank. They seized one tower, then opened its interior gates, and suddenly the walls that had stood undefeated for centuries against Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Rus began to unravel from within. On land, Latin infantry saw the Venetian banners rise above the sea gate and launched their own assault. Wooden towers creaked forward. Crossbow volleys blackened the sky. The defenders, already divided between two fronts, now fought in collapsing corridors of flame, splintered barricades, and falling stone. Alexios V Doukas, who seized the throne only months earlier, realized the truth. The walls could not be held. His soldiers were exhausted, the population no longer trusted him, and the Crusaders no longer cared for negotiations. Before nightfall, he fled. By dusk, Latin troops pushed deep into the Sea District. Flames climbed the wooden houses. Smoke rolled across the city in black sheets. The sound of steel on marble echoed across the harbor as Crusader boots entered Constantinople for the first time. They had come in the name of Christ. Now they entered as conquerors. The morning after the walls fell, Constantinople did not awaken to victory or surrender. It awakened to plunder. For the first time in 9 centuries, the Queen of Cities lay open before an invading army, and the men who entered her were not unbelievers, but Christians carrying the cross. The sack began instantly. Venetian sailors flooded in from the harbor, torchlight reflecting off water still choked with debris. French and Flemish knights streamed through the broken land gates. They expected resistance, ambush, some final stand. But instead, they found a city collapsing into chaos. Families fled through narrow alleys clutching icons. Merchants sealed their doors, praying the iron bars would hold. Monasteries filled with monks chanting psalms that trembled with fear rather than devotion. But once the tide of soldiers entered, no wall, no prayer, no sanctuary could stop what followed. The churches were the first to fall. Hagia Sophia, spiritual heart of Eastern Christendom, was transformed overnight into a treasury for looters. Soldiers pried open altars, stripped relics of their gold casings, and ripped jewels from icons centuries older than the nations that now plundered them. A prostitute was placed on the patriarch's throne. Knights drank wine beneath a mosaic of Christ Pantocrator, while piles of manuscripts burned in the courtyard. One chronicler wrote, "We came to reclaim Jerusalem, but we behaved as if we meant to burn it." The smaller chapels fared no better. Relics of saints were carried off like trophies. Bronze doors were hacked apart for their metal. Silk banners embroidered in the time of Justinian were trampled under boots. For 3 days, Constantinople became an open wound. Women and children vanished into the night. Homes were emptied, horses stabled in sanctuaries, mosaics smashed from walls. The bronze horses of the hippodrome, symbols of imperial triumph, were torn down and shipped to Venice. Even the sea groaned under new burdens. Ships overloaded with wealth, icons, gold plate, ivories, relics. Objects meant for worship now treated as spoils of revenge. When word reached Rome, Pope Innocent III did not celebrate. He grieved. His letters condemned what he called a crime against the body of Christ. A crime committed not by infidels, but by those who marched under his name. But his words changed nothing. The damage was done. Constantinople had survived the armies of the Caliphate. It had outlasted Persians, Avars, and Rus. But it could not survive the holy fury of men who believed God would forgive whatever they claimed to do in his service. And beneath the ashes of 1204 lay the first cracks of a division that would last 1,000 years. A split not of doctrine, but of trust. The Crusaders had won the city, but Christendom had lost itself. The smoke had barely lifted when the conquerors began dividing the ruins. Constantinople, once the second Jerusalem, the jewel of Eastern Christendom, now lay silent beneath a sky the color of cold ash. Marble halls were cracked open, palaces gutted, and mosaics dulled by a film of soot. The greatest Christian city in the world had become a marketplace for power. And into that stillness, the Crusaders marched as if claiming an inheritance. Before the dead were buried, before the churches were cleansed of the stench of fire, the victors proclaimed a new creation, the Latin Empire of Constantinople. But this was not an empire forged in faith. It was an empire assembled from debts, spoils, and an uneasy coalition of barons and merchants. In the shattered palace of Blachernay, its floors still streaked with ash, the Venetians and Crusader lords carved up the Byzantine world. Ports, islands, trade routes, fertile plains. Each was weighed, negotiated, and claimed like items on an auction table. Venice took nearly half the empire. The arteries of commerce, the keys to the Mediterranean. The Crusader barons took the rest. Thrace, Macedonia, the passes to the Black Sea. This was not conquest inspired by God. It was division inspired by opportunity. At the center of it all stood the most unlikely ruler of a shattered empire, Enrico Dandolo, the blind doge of Venice, 80 years old, eyes clouded. But no man's ambition burned brighter. He did not wear a crown. He did not need to. His fleet ruled the seas, and through it, he ruled the city. Baldwin of Flanders was crowned the first Latin emperor, young, pious, inexperienced. But the real power in Constantinople was the old Venetian, who could not see the city he now controlled. Outside the walls, the Byzantine nobility scattered into exile, carrying icons, manuscripts, and the last shreds of dignity. From these refugees rose three embers of Byzantium: the Empire of Nicaea, the Empire of Trebizond, the Despotate of Epirus. They were weak, divided, and wounded, yet alive. Byzantium had lost its heart, but not its memory. Inside the city, the new Latin Empire discovered the hollow truth. They had conquered only a corpse. The treasury was empty. The granaries burned. The population had fled. Trade routes had collapsed. They ruled a kingdom of ruins, surrounded by enemies, sustained only by Venetian ships. And in the monasteries of the East, priests whispered a prophecy that would prove true. The empire born today will die before the grandchildren of its conquerors. The Latin Empire began in triumph, and in that same moment began to crumble. The smoke of Constantinople did not vanish when the fires died. It settled into sermons, politics, memory. What the Crusaders destroyed in 3 days would scar Christianity for 8 centuries. A victory that felt like defeat. Across the Christian world, the news spread not as triumph, but as scandal. A crusade meant for Jerusalem had instead annihilated the greatest Christian city on earth. No justification, no debt, no promise, no treaty could hide the truth. Christians had destroyed their own capital of faith. In Rome, Pope Innocent III received the news in horror. He had dreamed of unity. Instead, he witnessed the deepest wound in Christian history. His letters condemned the Crusaders. "You have torn the body of Christ with your own hands." In the Orthodox East, the sack of 1204 was not a tragedy. It was a betrayal. Monks recorded the event with bitterness sharper than any sword. Churches once filled with incense now remembered Western boots. Priests spoke of the Latins not as misguided brethren, but as defilers. And this wound hardened into identity. The East would never again consider Rome a brother. Reconciliation became impossible. The Great Schism, once a theological division, became emotional, cultural, permanent. The blow to Byzantium was catastrophic. The empire fractured into shards. Its armies were scattered, its wealth stolen, its prestige shattered, its defenses broken. For centuries, Byzantium had been the shield protecting Europe from the rising Muslim empires. After 1204, that shield lay in pieces. The path from 1204 to the Ottoman conquest of 1453 was not fate. It was consequence. Eastern chroniclers later wrote, Constantinople did not fall to the Turks in 1453. It fell in 1204, long after the Latin Empire collapsed, long after the Crusader kingdoms vanished, long after the bones of Dandolo turned to dust beneath Hagia Sophia's floor. The shadow of 1204 remained. In liturgy, in politics, in the map of Europe, in every strained conversation between East and West. 1204 was the year faith turned inward and cut itself. A warning, preserved in the ashes of a fallen capital. Night returned to Constantinople, not with siege fires, but with the quiet heaviness that follows irreversible loss. The city did not look conquered. It looked abandoned by the very faith it had protected for nearly 1,000 years. Monks wandered through shattered chapels, gathering fragments of broken icons. Streets echoed with a stillness deeper than grief. The domes that once held the sound of choirs now held nothing but smoke. Constantinople did not fall to foreign conquerors. It fell to men who crossed themselves before battle, men who carried the cross on their shields, men who believed God marched with them. But faith without humility becomes ambition, and ambition wearing the clothes of faith becomes something far more dangerous. The city's downfall was not a military failure. It was a spiritual one. It fell because Christians no longer feared betraying each other. It fell because debt spoke louder than Scripture. It fell because unity collapsed long before the walls did. And in its destruction, a warning was carved into the silence. A faith divided by pride becomes its own worst enemy. A mirror for every generation. The sack of Constantinople is not just a medieval tragedy. It is a mirror, reflecting what happens when holy causes lose their holiness, when believers forget the meaning of the symbol they carry. Standing in the ruins, one truth becomes unmistakable. The walls did not fall to unbelievers, but to believers who forgot what their faith meant. History has been echoing that truth ever since.